Now, I'm going to speak for 30 minutes and I'm going to call my presentation "Money Reform is the lighthouse that overlooks our troubled economic sea." I'm going to split my 30 minutes into three sections. Firstly, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of money reform, because some of you might not actually know exactly what I'm talking about when I use that phrase. And I'm going to take you back in time to 1844, when the British Parliament created what could loosely be termed the first money reform law. And so in that sense, I'm going to show that we're not saying anything new. We're building on legislation which has already been passed by Westminster. Secondly, in the middle part of my talk, I'm going to come back to the present. I'm going to explain to you the consequences of the present system. And then finally, I'm going to introduce you to the fully worked out money reform proposal that we have at the present time and that some of us are promoting. And at the same time, I'm going to answer the question which our chairman has posed: is EU membership a roadblock to monetary reform? And while I'm doing this, keep in your head that metaphor of the lighthouse that overlooks our troubled economic sea, upon which our ships of state are struggling and sinking. The money reform lighthouse, in the words of the song, shines the light around us so that we might clearly see. And if it wasn't for this money reform lighthouse, where would our economies be? So that's a paraphrase of a song, I should add. So before we go anywhere, let me just summarize the monetary reform proposal in two short sentences. One, we believe that the power to create money should be taken from the banks and returned to the people to whom it properly belongs. And I'm going to say that again because it's very important. The power to create money should be taken from the banks and returned to the people to whom it properly belongs. And the second sentence is that we, the people, should enjoy, through our national institutions, the privilege and the profit of that money creation power. We, the people, should enjoy, through our national institutions, the privilege and profit of that money creation power. So those are the basic principles which we believe and upon which we make our stand. And the policy that we want to achieve, and which we as money reformers strongly demand, is two-step. First step, commercial banks to be forbidden from creating money out of nothing. All money to be created by a national institution accountable to us democratically through Parliament. So I'll say that again as well. Commercial banks to be forbidden from creating money out of nothing. All money to be created by a national institution accountable to us democratically through Parliament. And the step two is that the commercial banks will then compete with each other in the normal marketplace to attract that money into their savings accounts, and will only lend out that money which they have acquired in that way. So now some history. Let's go back to 1844. Now back in 1844, the commercial high street banks were actually allowed to create their own banknotes. And a school of thought got up at that time called the British Currency School that said, well, hang on a minute. If we're going to allow these commercial high street banks to print their own paper money, that's going to cause inflation. And indeed it was causing inflation at the time. And so in 1844, under the Conservative government of Robert Peel, They brought in the Bank Charter Act, and that prohibited commercial banks from creating banknotes, and it said that the only institution that could create money, the only institution that could create banknotes, was the Bank of England. And that's where we are today. That law has remained in place. And that was back in the day when most people who had money at all used notes and coins for their daily transactions. It was long before everybody had a bank account. It was long before checkbooks, and of course it was long before today, where most money is actually transacted in electronic format in credit and debit cards. Now, in some ways, the Bank Charter Act could be said loosely to be a monetary reform law, because it was at least attempting to state the principle that money creation is a national prerogative. It's not a private commercial enterprise. It's a national prerogative, and therefore a national institution should be creating that money. And that was the Bank of England at the time. If we ignore the fact that the Bank of England at the time was actually still a private corporation, nevertheless the thought was there. This act, however, did continue to ignore the fact that banks could continue to extend more credit than they actually had in reserves, which meant they were effectively creating money every time they created a loan, every time they extended credit that was greater than the money they actually had in the safe. They were effectively creating money. They were enjoying the privilege and the profit and the power which comes from creating the national money supply, and of course they're still doing it today. But today, notes and coins is actually a very small element of the national money supply. The Bank of England creates those still. Most money is electronic money created by the commercial banks every time they create a loan. Most money today is digital money, created and lent electronically and spent largely electronically with plastic. So every time banks extend new credit, they're effectively creating new money. Now, are you skeptical of that claim? The claim that every time banks extend credit, they're creating the national money supply? Well, here is Martin Wolf, the chief economics editor at the Financial Times. He says, quote, "The essence of the contemporary monetary system is creation of money out of nothing by private banks, often foolish lending." Here's a financial columnist, Dan Atkinson, writing in his book, Everything You Need to Know About the City and How the Financial Markets Work. Speaking of banks, he says, banks do not just lend out deposits, they create new money. Banks can lend out £100 for every £8 they take in deposits. How? Because only a small proportion of deposits is ever taken out on any one day, and the loans themselves are redeposited, thus forming the basis for new loans. And so it goes on. Here's President Barack Obama. He says the truth is that $1 of capital in a bank can actually result in $8 or $10 of loans to families and businesses. And for those of you who want to know more about how that system actually works and the mechanics of it, I've written a 3-page article in Prosperity, and I've got copies over there on the table for you, entitled How the Fractional Reserve System Works. So the nation's money supply is not, contrary to popular belief, created by the institution round the corner. It's created by commercial banks. It's created overwhelmingly by commercial banks every time they make new loans by multiplying up on the basis of their actual reserves. And of course they create this money as debt. It's debt-based money. There is really no debt-free supply of money in our economy. Banks creating digital money out of nothing is the nation's money supply. So we say the law, which made it illegal in 1844 for banks to create money by printing paper money should be updated to the 21st century to recognise that it should be illegal today for banks to continue to create money by printing digital money.